My wife became the CEO and shred my contract in front of the board. This is what your loyalty is worth. She stopped laughing when my lawyer presented the original digital copy, pointing to paragraph 7. Breach of contract forfeits all 34 of the company's patents back to me, the original inventor. You know how Silicon Valley mythology loves to romanticize the garage startup? Well, screw the garage. We started in a literal broom closet. Not metaphorically, not. It was so small it felt like a broom closet, but an actual goddamn utility room above payday paradise, where desperate people traded their next paycheck for enough cash to keep the lights on another week. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were building the future while squatting above a monument to financial desperation. 15 years ago, it was just 4 of us crammed into that 8x10 tomb, sharing space with industrial-grade toilet paper and the ghost of Pine Sol past. The air conditioning unit was a temperamental piece of shit from the Carter administration that had a stroke every time someone dared to microwave cup noodles, which, considering our startup budget consisted of loose change and dreams, happened approximately 17 times a day. I swear that AC was powered by spite and held together with duct tape prayers. I spent most of those early days hunched over a desk made from a door and cinder blocks, scrolling through eBay auctions like a digital archaeologist. Need a servo motor? Check. Microcontroller that didn't cost more than my rent? Maybe. Circuit boards that hadn't been rejected by NASA for being too sketchy? Let's roll the dice. My fingertips looked like a roadmap of burns from wrestling with a soldering iron that had more attitude than a teenage barista. But slowly, methodically, I built something that actually worked, an ugly little box that hummed with purpose instead of just humming with broken dreams. That prototype became Patent Hash 1. Sounds cooler than it was, trust me. It was basically a sophisticated way to optimize manufacturing processes, but calling it Hash 1 made it sound like we were cooking up the next Google instead of just trying to make factories run less like garbage fires. Then came Patent Hash 2 and 3, and suddenly we had something that looked like intellectual property instead of just intellectual curiosity. By year 5, Jesus, 5 years of living on energy drinks and the kind of optimism that only comes from not knowing how badly things could go, I'd filed 16 patents. 16. Each one registered to the company with my name proudly displayed as the original inventor, like getting credit on a high school science project that happened to change the world. No corner office with a view of anything better than the payday loan neon. No team of eager MBA grads ready to disrupt my disruption. Just me, a whiteboard that had seen better decades, and the kind of creative freedom that comes from everyone else being too busy to micromanage your genius. But here's the thing about those early days that the business school case studies always get wrong. It wasn't just about the tech. I learned real fast that brilliant innovation dies a slow, bureaucratic death if your compliance is sloppier than a drunk guy trying to eat soup. So while everyone else was worried about pivot strategies and growth hacking, I kept our chain of title cleaner than a Mormon's browser history. Our patent claims were tighter than a Silicon Valley CEO's NDA. Our filings hit the USPTO like clockwork, because missing deadlines is how you go from disruptive innovator to cautionary tale. Meanwhile, my wife Aurelia Stone was grinding through law school with the kind of methodical brutality that would make a Navy SEAL instructor proud. She was a moot court assassin, the kind of student who had color-coded note cards for her color-coded note cards. Her life was coffee, casebooks, and more coffee, with occasional breaks to remind me that contracts weren't just suggestions and that intellectual property law wasn't something I could figure out on Wikipedia at 2 a.m. We'd share takeout on the floor of whatever cramped space we called home that month, spreading General Tso's chicken and lo mein between us like a picnic in purgatory. But we had something better than money or space. We had a shared dream that didn't sound completely insane when we said it out loud. We wanted to build technology that actually mattered, not just another app to help people share pictures of their breakfast or connect with other people who also enjoyed taking pictures of their breakfast. I didn't give a shit about stock options or company retreats where grown adults played trust falls and called it team building. I cared about code that worked and contracts that held up in court. Every line I wrote, every circuit I soldered, every patent application I filed, it all had to be bulletproof, because in the real world, brilliant ideas with sloppy execution don't become success stories. They become expensive lessons for the next guy. Looking back now, those were the days of quiet power instead of stage lights. No TED Talks about changing the world one algorithm at a time. No glossy magazine profiles about my morning routine or my thoughts on work-life balance. Just me in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning supplies and broken dreams, building something that would eventually be worth more than the payday loan shop beneath us made in a decade. The freedom to build without committees and focus groups and stakeholder meetings was intoxicating. Every problem was mine to solve, every solution was mine to implement, and every victory, no matter how small, was earned through pure, unfiltered effort. No corner office politics, no performance reviews, no strategic pivots based on what some consultant read in Harvard Business Review. Just clean code, solid patents, and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that separates the companies that matter from the ones that become footnotes in business school textbooks. Those 16 patents weren't just paperwork. They were proof that innovation could survive in a broom closet above a payday loan shop, as long as you kept your compliance tight and your vision tighter. The licensing deals started trickling in like a leaky faucet. Automation here, pharmaceutical manufacturing there. Nothing that would make us rich, but enough to prove that our ugly little boxes weren't just expensive paperweights. Then the big boys came knocking. Not the Silicon Valley darlings with their hoodies and kombucha, but the real players. Defense contractors with budgets bigger than some countries' GDP, manufacturing giants who measured success in megatons and quarterly earnings that could fund small wars. These weren't the kind of clients who cared about our startup story or our scrappy origins above payday paradise. They wanted to see spreadsheets, compliance documentation, and ironclad intellectual property portfolios that wouldn't crumble under the kind of legal scrutiny that comes with billion-dollar government contracts. Lucky for us, I'd been paranoid about that shit since day one, keeping our patent filings cleaner than a Swiss bank account and our chain of custody more documented than a crime scene. We closed our Series A round with a venture capital fund that had the kind of pedigree that makes other VCs weep with envy. Former Goldman Sachs partners who'd transitioned from moving money to making it multiply. $22 million, which sounds like monopoly money when you're used to scraping together quarters for ramen, but felt like divine intervention when the wire transfer hit our account. Suddenly, we had runway, real office space, and employees who weren't related to us or sleeping on our couch. Series B came 18 months later with not one, but two venture capital funds who looked at our patent stack like it was a rare art collection. This isn't just intellectual property. One partner told me during due diligence, adjusting his Tom Ford glasses with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. This is an asset class. They threw $47 million at us like they were buying futures on the apocalypse, which, given our defense contractor clients, wasn't entirely inaccurate. With real money came real executives. The board hired Naomi Quintero as CFO. Harvard MBA, former McKinsey consultant, the kind of financial strategist who could make a lemonade stand's P&L look like a Fortune 500 acquisition target. She had this way of speaking in corporate poetry, turning basic business operations into synergistic value propositions and strategic optimization initiatives. But she knew her numbers. And more importantly, she knew how to make our numbers look sexy to investors who measured success in EBITDA and market penetration metrics. Our general counsel, Victor Shun, was the anti-lawyer lawyer, methodical instead of dramatic, precise instead of pompous. Ex-Big Law who'd burned out on billable hours and decided he'd rather build something than just defend it. He ran our legal department like a Swiss watch. Every contract reviewed 3 times. Every compliance requirement documented and cross-referenced, every potential litigation risk identified and mitigated before it could metastasize into an actual problem. Meanwhile, I kept shipping patents like a machine gun loaded with innovation. Patent 27 was the breakthrough that cut assembly costs by 19%, which sounds modest until you realize that 19% of a $100 million manufacturing process is enough money to buy a small island. Patent 31 boosted safety protocols so dramatically that OSHA actually wrote us a goddamn thank you note, which I framed and hung in the lab like a participation trophy for not killing anyone. But Patent 34 was the nuclear option, adaptive switching technology that let factories reconfigure production lines on the fly instead of shutting down for weeks every time they needed to manufacture something different. That little innovation unlocked $280 million in new contracts. Because apparently the ability to pivot from making car parts to making airplane engines without missing a quarterly deadline is worth approximately one CEO's yearly compensation package. The success was intoxicating, but success has a way of making you paranoid about losing what you've built. Right after a major robotics client insisted on immaculate IP ownership documentation for their compliance audit, the kind of language that makes lawyers rich and inventors nervous, I decided it was time for some insurance. I retained Eric Hale, a quiet ex-litigator who looked like an accountant but fought like a prize fighter. He'd spent 15 years at white shoe firms representing Fortune 500 companies in the kind of courtroom battles that determine whether entire industries live or die, before deciding he preferred building cases to just winning them. Every Thursday, we'd meet at Murphy's Diner, a greasy spoon 2 blocks from the federal courthouse, where the coffee tasted like burned regret and the hash browns came with a side of existential dread. Over weeks of institutional coffee and conversations that probably violated several NDAs, we rewrote my employment agreement line by line. Eric had this way of dissecting legal language like a surgeon performing brain surgery. Every word deliberate, every clause positioned with surgical precision, every potential loophole sealed tighter than a submarine door. We buried our nuclear option in paragraph 7, hidden among standard employment boilerplate like a landmine in a flower garden. If termination is in breach of contract, all registered patents credited to the original inventor revert to said inventor with full rights of use, licensing, and transfer. It read like standard legal language, the kind of clause that corporate lawyers skim over on their way to the important stuff. But Eric crafted it with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the subtlety of a professional assassin. The digital notarization was a work of art. Blockchain timestamp, geo-locked verification, fingerprint-embedded authentication that would hold up in any court from here to The Hague. We stored it on 3 different servers across 2 continents, with an offline backup locked in a fireproof box in Eric's office safe. If they wanted to challenge the authenticity of this document, they'd need resources that would make the Pentagon's budget look like pocket change. Then we said absolutely nothing to anyone. No announcements, no corporate communications, no casual mentions during all-hands meetings. The beauty of paragraph 7 wasn't just its legal precision, it was its invisibility. As far as the company knew, I was still the loyal inventor employee, happy to build their future while they managed the business side of making us all rich. But I slept better knowing that if things went sideways, I had more than just moral authority and hurt feelings. I had legal leverage that could turn their corporate success story into a cautionary tale about treating your original inventors like disposable assets instead of irreplaceable partners. Success has this sneaky way of changing everything while pretending nothing's different. The furniture got fancier first. Herman Miller chairs that cost more than my first car, standing desks with built-in wireless charging pads, conference tables made from reclaimed teak that probably had more environmental certifications than most Fortune 500 companies. We ditched the broom closet for 3 floors downtown, then traded up again to a glass tower in the financial district with badge access, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a lobby barista who knew my order before I opened my mouth. The barista thing should have been a warning sign. When your startup has evolved to the point where you need a full-time caffeine artist who memorizes executive preferences like a sommelier studying wine pairings, you've officially crossed from disruptive innovation into corporate bureaucracy with better coffee. But hell, the espresso was perfect every morning, so I ignored the existential implications of having personalized beverage service. The faces changed too. And not just because we'd gone from 4 people sharing takeout to 200 employees spread across multiple departments with titles that sounded like they'd been generated by a business school random phrase generator. Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, Director of Customer Success and Engagement, Lead Architect of Digital Transformation Initiatives. Half these people probably couldn't explain what our patents actually did, but they sure could present quarterly metrics that made our growth trajectory look like a rocket ship aimed at the moon. Aurelia's transformation was the most dramatic and, honestly, the most unsettling. She'd finished law school with honors, law review, Order of the Coif, the whole academic aristocracy package, and initially joined Preston, Wild & Associates. One of those white-shoe corporate law firms where junior associates bill 3,000 hours a year and consider sleep a luxury for people without partnership ambitions. But 6 months into her big law career, she jumped ship to join us in-house as deputy counsel. Smart move, financially speaking. Instead of grinding through document review for some partner's yacht fund, she was getting equity in a company that was about to become Silicon Valley's newest darling. Within 2 years, she'd climbed from deputy counsel to general counsel to chief strategy officer, a trajectory that would have taken a decade at any traditional law firm. The investors loved her. Crisp PowerPoint presentations that turned complex technical specifications into compelling investment narratives, Tom Ford suits that screamed competence and success, and the kind of flawless Q&A skills that could make a product recall sound like a strategic pivot toward customer-centric excellence. She had this way of speaking to venture capitalists that was part legal precision, part MBA buzzword bingo, part pure Silicon Valley mythology. We're not just disrupting manufacturing automation, she'd tell rooms full of potential investors. We're creating a paradigm shift in how industrial IoT integrates with machine learning to optimize supply chain efficiency. The VCs would nod like she'd just explained the meaning of life, then write checks with more zeros than a small country's national debt. But while Aurelia was becoming the company's public face and strategic mastermind, something weird started happening to me. Calendar invites that used to include me automatically. Product roadmaps, budget reviews, shareholder preparation meetings suddenly didn't. Not essential for today's discussion, Naomi would write in emails that felt soft as velvet and sharp as surgical steel. We'll catch you up on the key decisions afterward. Afterward never came, of course. I'd hear about major strategic pivots through Slack channels or overhear conversations in the break room where junior product managers discussed initiatives I'd supposedly signed off on but had never actually seen. My input on technical feasibility went from essential to advisory to we'll loop you in if we need specifics on the underlying patent architecture. A pair of my best engineers, Ria Kim and Dario Velis, brilliant developers who could debug machine learning algorithms like other people solve crossword puzzles, were temporarily reassigned to something called an AI innovation pod. The air quotes around innovation pod were audible in every company-wide email, and the temporary nature of their reassignment felt about as permanent as a Supreme Court appointment. They were supposed to be exploring next-generation applications of our core technology, but somehow their work never seemed to intersect with mine anymore. I didn't yell or send passive-aggressive emails or schedule confrontational one-on-one meetings. That's not my style, and honestly, corporate drama gives me hives. Instead, I documented everything. Every budget cut that affected my department. Every asset shift that moved resources away from R&D into customer acquisition or market expansion. Every meeting I wasn't invited to, every decision made without my input, every strategic pivot that treated our core technology like a commodity instead of the foundation that made everything else possible. The smell of a storm was unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Venture capital firms don't invest $47 million so you can keep building cool gadgets in a lab. They want exits, liquidity events, returns that make their limited partners happy enough to invest in the next fund. And exits require either IPOs or acquisitions, both of which are easier to execute when you have streamlined leadership and focused strategic vision, instead of the messy reality of shared decision-making between founders who might have different ideas about the company's future. I'd seen this movie before, heard stories from other technical founders who'd been gradually marginalized as their companies scaled. The pattern was always the same. First, they reduce your operational authority. Then they question your strategic relevance. Then they restructure your role into something ceremonial before ultimately deciding that your legacy contributions are appreciated, but your ongoing involvement isn't necessary for the company's continued success. But I had something most of those other founders didn't. Paragraph 7, buried in my employment agreement like a legal landmine, waiting patiently for someone to step on it. Let them play their boardroom games and strategic maneuvering. I'd keep building, keep documenting, and keep watching. Because in the end, corporate politics are just theater, but intellectual property rights are real, and mine were protected by more than just corporate goodwill and founder loyalty. The board decided to throw what they called a strategy summit. which is corporate speak for expensive party where we pretend important decisions happen instead of just rubber stamping what we already decided in smaller, more exclusive rooms. $48,000 for a single evening at some midtown venue that probably charged by the thread count of their tablecloths. I know the exact cost because Naomi's assistant accidentally CC'd me on the invoice before quickly sending a follow-up email with please disregard previous message and what I can only assume was a silent prayer that I wouldn't screenshot the evidence of their fiscal responsibility. The venue was the kind of place that screams, "We have arrived," in 12 different languages, with uplighting that cost more than most people's cars and monogram macarons that bore our company logo like tiny, edible business cards. Everything was precisely arranged to photograph well for the corporate LinkedIn posts that would inevitably follow. Artfully positioned networking clusters, strategically placed venture capital partners, and enough branded swag to supply a small conference on the virtues of disruptive innovation. I arrived wearing my cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt that hadn't come from the clearance rack, which automatically made me the most underdressed person in a room full of people who measured their net worth in stock options and quarterly board meeting attendance. But that was fine. I'd brought my own entertainment in the form of a clean notebook and the kind of anthropological curiosity that comes from watching corporate theater performed by people who take themselves very seriously. Aurelia made her entrance like she was starring in her own corporate success story, stepping out of a black Tesla Model S that definitely hadn't been purchased with our joint household budget. The car was sleek and silent, the automotive equivalent of her new professional persona. Expensive, efficient, and completely disconnected from our broom closet origins. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than our first month's rent above payday paradise. And when she walked into that $48,000 room, every conversation briefly paused like she was the guest of honor at her own coronation. Which, in retrospect, she was. I positioned myself at the back with my notebook, close enough to hear the presentations, but far enough away to observe without being observed. My fingernails still had traces of machine oil from the morning's work. Real work, building actual things instead of building PowerPoint slides about building things. The contrast wasn't lost on me, and it definitely wasn't lost on the venture capital partners who looked at me like I was a museum exhibit. Behold, the technical founder in his natural habitat. The presentations were a masterclass in corporate bullshit bingo. A private equity partner with the kind of artificially perfect smile that suggests extensive dental work and regular Botox appointments talked about portfolio optimization and strategic value maximization. He used phrases like operational excellence and synergistic acquisition potential with the reverence of a televangelist discussing salvation, while clicking through slides that reduced our years of innovation to colorful charts and market penetration metrics. Someone from the back of the room, I think it was one of our Series B lead investors, though honestly all these venture capital types blend together after a while, asked whether our AI and SaaS modules could be made more viral. Like intellectual property was a TikTok dance or a celebrity scandal instead of years of methodical engineering and patent development. I almost laughed out loud, but settled for making a note in my notebook that simply read, "Jesus fucking Christ." The whole evening felt like watching someone else's life being planned without their input. Strategic roadmaps that ignored the technical complexity of implementation. Market expansion plans that assumed our competitors would just politely wait while we executed our brilliant strategy. Partnership opportunities that sounded suspiciously like acquisition discussions disguised as collaboration initiatives. Everyone was very excited about our IP portfolio and our market positioning, but nobody seemed particularly interested in the messy reality of actually building the technology that made all their charts and projections possible. At home afterward, I found a bottle of Macallan 25 waiting on our bar like an apology I hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. The bottle probably cost more than our first office rent, and it sat there among our regular collection of wine and bourbon like a monument to the distance that had grown between who we used to be and who we were becoming. Macallan 25 isn't something you buy for yourself. It's something you buy to impress people, to signal that you've arrived at a level of success where $1,000 whiskey is just another Tuesday night luxury. In bed, Aurelia's conversation had transformed into something that sounded like it had been focus grouped and market tested. She talked about runway extension and equity stories and acquisition readiness, like she was rehearsing for another investor presentation instead of talking to her husband about our shared future. Every sentence felt crafted for maximum strategic impact, every pause calculated for dramatic effect. I wanted verifiable results, patents that worked, products that solved real problems, innovations that made the world slightly less stupid. She wanted velocity, momentum, the kind of exponential growth that looks impressive in quarterly board meetings and makes venture capital partners happy enough to write bigger checks for the next funding round. We'd stopped speaking the same language, even though all the individual words were identical. When she said innovation, she meant market differentiation. When I said innovation, I meant something that didn't exist yesterday but works today. When she talked about scaling our intellectual property portfolio, she was thinking about licensing deals and revenue streams. When I heard intellectual property portfolio, I thought about the unglamorous hours of soldering and coding and debugging that had created something worth scaling in the first place. The private elevator in our building had started feeling symbolic. We could share the same physical space, press the same buttons, arrive at the same floor, but we were traveling toward completely different destinations. She was ascending toward corporate leadership and strategic decision-making and all the executive perks that come with being the public face of a successful technology company. I was just trying to keep building things that mattered, one patent at a time, while documenting every sign that the storm was getting closer. The ambush came on a Tuesday morning, because apparently corporate betrayal follows the same scheduling principles as quarterly earnings calls and annual performance reviews. I should have seen it coming when my calendar invite for the monthly board meeting arrived with a different conference room than usual. The big one on the 32nd floor with the walnut table that cost more than most people's cars, and the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's skyline, as if witnessing the city's corporate empire would somehow legitimize whatever bureaucratic assassination they planned. I walked into that room expecting the usual tedium of financial reviews and strategic planning discussions, maybe some debate about our Q4 pipeline or the competitive landscape analysis that Naomi had been obsessing over for weeks. Instead, I found a carefully orchestrated theatrical production that would have made Shakespeare proud if Shakespeare had written corporate thrillers about intellectual property theft and spousal betrayal. The walnut table was set like a formal dinner party, with precisely positioned bottles of San Pellegrino and legal pads arranged at exact intervals. Every director had claimed their usual seat, forming a semicircle of expensive suits and practiced poker faces that screamed, "We've already made our decision, and this meeting is just ceremonial documentation." The lighting was perfect, the acoustics were flawless, and the whole scene felt like it had been designed by someone who understood that important moments require proper staging. Aurelia walked in first, and that detail should have been my final warning. She never entered board meetings first. Usually she arrived exactly 90 seconds before the scheduled start time, carrying her leather portfolio and wearing the kind of composed expression that suggested she'd spent the previous hour reviewing talking points and anticipating potential challenges. But today she led the procession like she owned the room, which, as I was about to discover, she basically did. Her title had changed again, apparently. The nameplate in front of her chair read, Chief Executive Officer, in the kind of understated font that costs extra because it's supposed to look effortlessly elegant. When the hell had that happened? The last board meeting minutes I'd seen had listed her as Chief Strategy Officer, but evidently there had been some executive reshuffling that nobody had bothered to mention to the company's original technical founder and largest individual patent holder. She was flanked by Victor Shun and Naomi Quintero, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else but had resigned themselves to playing their assigned roles in this particular corporate drama. Victor kept adjusting his tie, a nervous tic I'd noticed during hostile contract negotiations, and Naomi was reviewing the same page of notes over and over, like she was memorizing lines for a performance she didn't want to give. The presentation started normally enough. Quarterly revenue figures that looked impressive on PowerPoint slides, client acquisition metrics that suggested we were crushing our strategic objectives, partnership opportunities that could potentially unlock new market segments. Standard board meeting theater, The kind of corporate kabuki that makes everyone feel important while avoiding any actual decision-making. Then Aurelia reached under the table. She pulled out a manila folder that looked ancient compared to the sleek digital presentations that usually dominated our board meetings. The folder was weathered and slightly discolored, with a coffee stain at the corner that I recognized immediately because I'd made that stain during our third year, back when we were still sharing office space with a tax preparation service and surviving on gas station coffee and pure entrepreneurial delusion. It was my original employment agreement. The paper version, the one we'd signed when the company was just 4 people with a shared dream and a collective bank account that barely covered rent. Before the series of funding, before the glass tower offices, before the venture capital partners who measured our success in EBITDA multiples and market penetration analytics. Back when contracts were printed on actual paper and signed with actual pens, she held that folder like it was evidence in a murder trial, which, metaphorically speaking, it was. Then she did something that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. She fed it, inch by inch, into a paper shredder that had been positioned next to her chair like a prop in some avant-garde performance art piece about corporate dissolution. The sound was deliberate, methodical, final. Each page disappeared into mechanical teeth that turned our shared history into confetti, transforming years of mutual trust and partnership into strips of paper that would eventually end up in some office building's recycling program. The coffee stain that had survived 5 office moves and countless reorganizations vanished into industrial destruction, taking with it any pretense that this was still the company we'd built together. "This is what your loyalty is worth," she said, making direct eye contact for the first time since she'd entered the room. Her voice was steady, professional, completely devoid of the emotion that should accompany the destruction of a marriage disguised as a business partnership. A couple of the directors did that uncomfortable laugh people make when they're not sure whether they're witnessing comedy or tragedy, the kind of nervous sound that fills awkward silences during hostile takeovers and divorce proceedings. The laugh died quickly when they realized that nobody else was finding this moment particularly amusing. "We appreciate your legacy contributions," Aurelia continued, and the word legacy hit me like a physical blow. Legacy, past tense, historical significance. The kind of language people use when they're discussing dead presidents or retired athletes, not active founders who'd spent 15 years building the intellectual property foundation that made the entire company possible. She fired me in one breath and pivoted to Q3 pipeline discussions in the next, treating the termination of my employment like a line item in the quarterly budget review. No explanation of cause, no discussion of transition planning, no acknowledgement that removing the original technical founder might require some strategic consideration. Just, "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," followed by, "Now let's review our customer acquisition metrics for the Northeastern market segment." The whole performance was designed to be humiliating, and I have to admit it was professionally executed. They'd calculated every detail to maximize psychological impact while minimizing legal exposure. The paper shredding was pure theater, dramatic enough to send a clear message about power dynamics, but ultimately meaningless since paper contracts can be contested, challenged, or potentially reconstructed through document recovery services. I said only one word: "Noted." Then I stood up, straightened my shirt, and walked out of that walnut-paneled boardroom with the kind of dignity that comes from knowing something your audience doesn't. They thought the paper was the contract. They thought destroying the physical document would somehow erase the legal obligations and intellectual property protections that actually mattered. They'd spent so much time planning their corporate theater that they'd forgotten to consider the possibility that their target might have been planning his own performance for considerably longer. It was just a souvenir. The real contract was safely stored on blockchain-verified servers across multiple continents, protected by more legal safeguards than a state secret and more backup systems than NASA uses for mission-critical data. But I let them have their moment of triumph. Sometimes the best revenge is letting your enemies think they've won. I met Eric Hale at Murphy's Diner exactly 47 minutes after walking out of that walnut-paneled boardroom, because when you've just been corporate executed by your own wife, you don't waste time on emotional processing. You get straight to the legal retaliation. The diner looked exactly the same as it had during our Thursday morning strategy sessions. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly jaundiced, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. Eric was already waiting in our usual booth, stirring his black coffee with the kind of methodical precision that had made him legendary in federal courtrooms before he decided that building cases was more satisfying than just winning them. He didn't ask me how I was feeling or whether I needed to talk through the emotional complexity of spousal betrayal disguised as corporate restructuring. He asked for details, specifics, documentation. The kind of factual foundation that transforms personal grievances into legally actionable claims. "Walk me through exactly what happened," he said, pulling out his legal pad like a detective taking witness statements. Timeline, witnesses present, exact language used, any recording devices or documentation. This is why I'd retained Eric instead of some flashy corporate litigation partner who would have wanted to discuss strategy over $18 cocktails at whatever steakhouse was currently popular with white-collar defense attorneys. I gave him the play-by-play, the Tuesday morning ambush, Aurelia's new CEO nameplate, the theatrical paper shredding, the legacy contributions dismissal, the seamless transition from termination to quarterly pipeline review. Eric took notes in his trademark shorthand, occasionally asking for clarification on specific board members' reactions or the exact phrasing of contractual language. By noon, he drafted and sent a breach notice that was simultaneously polite and legally devastating. The subject line read, "Activation of Paragraph 7, IP reversion," with all the understated elegance of a diplomatic declaration of war. The email went to 3 different recipients: the company's legal inbox, their outside counsel at Witt and Deering, and personally to Griffin Marks, the senior partner who'd handled our Series B legal documentation and presumably thought he understood every clause in every contract his firm had drafted. Attached to Eric's breach notice was a digital arsenal that would have made NSA cryptographers proud. The blockchain-verified employment agreement with cryptographic hash verification, geolocation stamps that proved where and when it had been signed, fingerprint authentication that connected the document to my biometric identity, and a comprehensive schedule of all 34 patents with registration numbers, current licensee information, and conservative market valuations that totaled somewhere north of $200 million. The fun started about 6 hours later. Our robotics load balancing module, the crown jewel of Patent 31 that had made OSHA write us that thank you note, suddenly developed what the system logs would later describe as an unexpected authorization failure. In plain English, the safety protocols that kept our biggest client's automated manufacturing line from turning into an industrial death trap had stopped accepting commands from anyone except the original patent holder, me. 6 hours of downtime at $24,000 per hour, according to the penalty clauses in their manufacturing contract. That's $144,000 in contractual damages, plus whatever productivity losses and missed delivery deadlines would cascade through their supply chain like a corporate cardiac arrest. But the real masterpiece was happening in Germany, where our biggest original equipment manufacturer partner, the kind of precision-obsessed German engineering firm that builds machines so reliable they make Swiss watches look sloppy, was suddenly very concerned about their compliance requirements. Ank Vogel, their legal director and the most terrifyingly efficient human being I've ever encountered, sent an email directly to my personal account with the kind of clinical precision that German attorneys deploy like surgical instruments. Her message was brief and devastating. Their procurement compliance clause required ongoing certification from the original patent inventor for any technology integrated into their manufacturing systems. Without that certification, they would be forced to halt shipments on approximately $60 million worth of pending orders, effective immediately, until proper intellectual property documentation could be verified and contractual obligations could be satisfied. The beautiful thing about German precision is that it's completely immune to corporate bullshit and emergency conference calls. When Ank Vogel says compliance clause, she means compliance clause, not compliance suggestion or compliance guideline that we can work around if the situation gets complicated. German engineering firms don't do workarounds. They do exactly what their contracts specify, with the kind of methodical adherence to legal requirements that makes American lawyers weep with envy. Inside the glass tower, I imagine the emergency meetings were spectacular. Senior executives who'd spent the morning celebrating their successful founder extraction were suddenly explaining to venture capital partners why their largest revenue streams had simultaneously developed critical technical failures. The same robotics clients who'd insisted on immaculate IP ownership documentation were now discovering that immaculate IP ownership is considerably more complex when the original inventor has been wrongfully terminated in breach of his employment contract. Naomi probably had to explain to the board why their quarterly projections had just developed a $200 million hole, while Victor was presumably researching whether corporate indemnification policies cover losses resulting from executive-level employment law violations. The irony was delicious. They'd fired me to streamline decision-making and eliminate potential complications, but they'd actually created the kind of operational crisis that makes Fortune 500 risk management departments wake up in cold sweats. For hours after Eric's breach notice hit their inboxes, Griffin Marks called him personally, not through assistants or junior associates, but a direct call from the senior partner who'd built his reputation on never losing corporate litigation cases and never letting clients expose themselves to unnecessary legal liability. "I've reviewed the materials," Griffin said, his voice carrying the kind of flat professional tone that corporate attorneys use when they're delivering very expensive bad news to very important clients. Paragraph 7 appears enforceable, not, "We'll contest this," or "We think we can challenge the validity," or "Let's explore our options." Enforceable. In legal terminology, that's not a concession. It's an obituary for whatever corporate strategy had led them to think they could fire the original patent holder without reading the fine print in his employment agreement. Eric hung up and looked at me across the diner table with something that might have been professional satisfaction. "They're going to want to talk," he said, refilling his coffee cup like we'd just concluded a successful acquisition negotiation instead of detonating a legal nuclear device in the middle of their corporate headquarters. I nodded and ordered another piece of pie. Sometimes the best part of having a perfect legal strategy is getting to watch it work exactly as designed. The public relations machine went into overdrive faster than a Tesla on autopilot hitting an open highway. Within 12 hours of our systems developing their mysterious authorization failures, Aurelia was standing in front of cameras for an emergency all-hands meeting that was being simultaneously broadcast to employees, streamed to investors, and probably recorded for posterity by whatever crisis management consultancy charges Fortune 500 companies 6 figures to make corporate disasters look like strategic pivots. She wore her best power suit, navy blue Tom Ford that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and delivered her lines with the kind of polished confidence that comes from extensive media training and complete disconnection from objective reality. "We want to assure all stakeholders that we remain in full control of our intellectual property portfolio," she said, looking directly into the camera with the unwavering eye contact that executive communications specialists teach during weekend retreats in the Hamptons. Her voice wobbled on control. Just slightly, just enough for anyone who knew her well enough to recognize the microscopic crack in her otherwise flawless corporate facade. But I caught it. Because 15 years of marriage teaches you to recognize when someone you love is lying through their teeth while standing in front of a company-wide audience and pretending that systematic technical failures are actually part of some master strategic plan. Privately, my phone had become the digital equivalent of a feeding frenzy. Every venture capital fund, private equity firm, and corporate development team that had ever heard our company name was suddenly very interested in having detailed conversations about intellectual property licensing, asset acquisition opportunities, and strategic partnership frameworks that sounded suspiciously like hostile takeover preparations disguised as collaboration initiatives. A venture studio in Palo Alto wanted to seed a legal tech startup around my contract analytics models. The kind of machine learning algorithms that could parse employment agreements and identify potential liability exposures before some founder gets terminated in breach of his intellectual property protections. They were offering $12 million in series of funding, office space in a building that probably had better coffee than most Fortune 500 headquarters, and equity terms that would make me the majority shareholder in whatever we decided to build together. A private equity fund with a portfolio that read like a who's who of industrial automation sent over a term sheet that was simultaneously generous and terrifying. $22 million upfront for my patent portfolio, plus ongoing royalty payments that could potentially reach 8 figures annually if they executed their acquisition strategy correctly. The managing partner had included a handwritten note explaining that they specialized in operational restructuring and management optimization, which is private equity speak for we fire everyone and strip the company for parts. But the most audacious offer came from Marcus Chun, CEO of Dynamo Systems, our biggest competitor and the kind of ruthless corporate strategist who probably keeps Sun Tzu's Art of War on his nightstand next to his sleep tracking device and his meditation app. Marcus sent a wooden box containing a bottle of Macallan 25, the same brand that had been appearing on our home bar like guilt-induced peace offerings, along with a card that was masterfully casual. Our Gulfstream G650 wheels up Friday afternoon if you want to discuss how we could put your innovations to better use. No lawyers, no contracts, just two engineers talking about the future. A private jet. Because apparently when you're trying to poach the original inventor away from a company that's hemorrhaging revenue due to intellectual property complications, you don't send a Toyota Camry. You send a $40 million aircraft that burns more money per hour than most people make in a year. I didn't board that jet. Not because I was afraid of Marcus or his acquisition strategy, but because I remembered exactly who I was before venture capital valuations and corporate restructuring had turned building technology into a blood sport disguised as innovation. I was the guy who'd built the first prototype in a broom closet above a payday loan shop, using parts scavenged from eBay and determination that came from having nothing to lose except the kind of dreams that keep you awake at night soldering circuits by the light of a desk lamp that cost $12 at Walmart. Every afternoon, Eric and I maintained our regular schedule at Murphy's Diner, treating the escalating corporate warfare like a chess match that happened to involve hundreds of millions of dollars and the future ownership of industrial automation technology. We let silence do most of the heavy lifting during negotiations because desperate people fill quiet moments with increasingly generous offers, while patient people just drink coffee and watch market forces work exactly as economic theory predicts they should. The numbers kept creeping upward like a stock ticker during a bull market. Someone dangled a state-of-the-art research facility in Seattle, complete with clean rooms and fabrication equipment that would make MIT's engineering department weep with envy. Someone else offered a board seat at a Fortune 500 manufacturing conglomerate, with the kind of executive compensation package that includes stock options, performance bonuses, and probably a company car that costs more than most people's houses. A consortium of German engineering firms, led by my old friend Anke Vogel, who understood compliance requirements better than most people understand their own social security numbers, submitted a joint proposal to license the entire patent portfolio for European manufacturing applications. Their offer included upfront payments, ongoing royalty structures, and exclusivity clauses that would essentially make me the intellectual property landlord for industrial automation across an entire continent. Meanwhile, inside the glass tower, the kind of corporate crisis management that makes McKinsey consultants rich was presumably happening at executive levels I was no longer invited to observe. Employees I'd mentored during their first weeks at the company were texting me from personal phones, using the kind of careful language that suggested they were afraid their corporate communications were being monitored by legal teams preparing for litigation. The messages painted a picture of systematic institutional panic. Litigation hold notices were flying around like confetti at a New Year's party, freezing email accounts and requiring employees to preserve every digital communication that might potentially be relevant to ongoing intellectual property disputes. Development repositories were being locked down tighter than nuclear launch codes, with access restricted to senior executives and outside counsel who presumably understood the legal implications of modifying code that might be subject to patent reversion claims. Compliance teams were working overtime to scrub deployment logs, trying to identify every client implementation that depended on my original patents and might be affected by whatever intellectual property settlement eventually emerged from this corporate clusterfuck. Quality assurance departments were probably running diagnostics on every system that had exhibited authorization failures, attempting to determine whether the technical problems were actually technical problems or just legal problems disguised as code errors. The shareholders were asking the right questions, finally. Not, how do we optimize our quarterly growth trajectory? Or, what's our competitive position in the emerging AI/SaaS market segment? But the fundamental question that should have been addressed before they decided to fire the original patent holder. Who actually owns the technology that makes this company worth more than the sum of its office furniture and employee stock option plans? The board meetings that I was no longer invited to attend were presumably featuring the kind of emergency strategic discussions that happen when venture capital partners realize their investment thesis was based on intellectual property ownership assumptions that may have been legally inaccurate. Naomi was probably explaining to incredulous investors why the company's most valuable assets might not actually belong to the company, while Victor was researching whether their directors' and officers' insurance policies covered losses resulting from employment law violations and patent ownership disputes. The beautiful thing about watching corporate warfare from the outside is that you can appreciate the strategic elegance without experiencing the existential terror. Every emergency board meeting, every crisis management consultant, every legal brief filed by Witt and Deering was ultimately just confirmation that paragraph 7 was working exactly as Eric had designed it to work. Like a legal virus that had been dormant in their corporate immune system, waiting patiently for someone to trigger the activation conditions. But I wasn't in any hurry to resolve the situation. Time was working in my favor, because every day that passed without a settlement meant more operational disruptions, more client relationship complications, and more pressure from investors who'd committed capital based on assumptions about intellectual property ownership that were proving to be significantly more complex than anyone had anticipated during due diligence. Marcus Chin's private jet was still available, according to his follow-up messages. The venture studio in Palo Alto had increased their Series A offer to $15 million. The private equity consortium had started making noises about potential acquisition premiums if I was interested in selling my patent portfolio to facilitate their hostile takeover strategy. But I kept thinking about that broom closet above payday paradise, and the kind of dreams that survive on coffee that tastes like burnt regret and determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. Before venture capital valuations and corporate restructuring had turned innovation into a commodity, I'd been building technology because it mattered, not because it generated attractive returns for institutional investors and management consulting fees for strategic advisory firms. The coffee at Murphy's Diner still tasted exactly the same as it had during our Thursday morning strategy sessions. Eric still took notes in his trademark shorthand, still asked the right questions, still understood that the best legal strategies unfold like symphonies, with patience, precision, and perfect timing. They'd created this mess by underestimating the original inventor. Now they could pay market rates to clean it up. I chose my wardrobe carefully for the final performance in their corporate theater. Clean shirt, not Tom Ford, not even close, just a button-down from Target that had survived multiple wash cycles without developing the kind of professional sheen that screams executive compensation package. Dark jeans that had actual wear patterns instead of designer distressing. And my scuffed work boots, the ones with machine oil stains and soldering burns that told the story of 15 years spent building actual things instead of just building PowerPoint presentations about building things. If they wanted theater, they could keep the stage and the costume budget and the professional lighting design to make everyone look like they belonged in a Fortune 500 annual report. I was bringing paperwork, leverage, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from owning the intellectual property that makes everything else possible. The boardroom looked exactly the same as it had during my corporate execution 3 weeks earlier. Walnut table that cost more than most people's cars, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan's financial district. Chairs positioned with the kind of geometric precision that suggests someone was paid serious money to optimize the feng shui of corporate decision-making. But the energy was completely different now. Instead of theatrical triumph, the room radiated the kind of barely controlled desperation that happens when venture capital partners start asking uncomfortable questions about asset ownership and quarterly projections develop $100 million holes. Aurelia sat at the head of the table wearing another Tom Ford creation, this one in charcoal gray that probably cost more than our first year's office rent. But the confident corporate CEO persona had developed some hairline cracks since our last encounter. She looked like a dagger, all right, but a dagger that had been used for too many battles and was starting to show signs of wear around the edges. Victor Shun had positioned himself strategically to her right, surrounded by enough legal documentation to supply a small law library, while Naomi Quintero occupied the other flank with spreadsheets and financial projections that I suspected painted a considerably less optimistic picture than whatever they'd been sharing with investors during their damage control campaign. Griffin Marks from Witt and Deering was present via video conference, his image displayed on a wall-mounted screen that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Even through digital compression, he looked like someone who'd spent the past 3 weeks explaining to very important clients why their presumably bulletproof legal strategy had developed some unexpected vulnerabilities. I set my leather folio down with the kind of deliberate precision that courtroom attorneys use when they're about to present evidence that will fundamentally change the trajectory of a case. The folio itself was nothing special. Brown leather that showed honest wear instead of artificial aging. Brass hardware that had actually tarnished through use instead of being manufactured to look vintage. But the documents inside represented the culmination of years of methodical legal preparation and strategic thinking that had apparently been significantly more sophisticated than anyone in this room had anticipated. I opened the folio and slid 2 documents across that walnut table with the kind of theatrical timing that would have made Shakespeare proud, if Shakespeare had written corporate thrillers about intellectual property warfare and spousal betrayal. The first document was a patent licensing agreement that Eric and I had crafted with the precision of Swiss watchmakers and the ruthlessness of private equity partners executing a leveraged buyout. Every clause had been reviewed, refined, and reinforced with the kind of legal language that sounds reasonable until you start calculating the long-term financial implications. The second document was a statement of intent to transfer IP portfolio to one of 4 named bidders, Marcus Chin's Dynamo Systems, the German engineering consortium led by Anke Vogel, the Palo Alto venture studio that wanted to build legal tech SaaS platforms, and a private equity fund that specialized in what they diplomatically called operational restructuring and what everyone else called corporate strip mining. 2 paths, I said, keeping my voice level and professional, like I was discussing quarterly budget allocations instead of potentially ending their company's existence as an independent entity. License the technology at market rates, or watch me sell the entire patent portfolio to people who would absolutely love to execute a quiet, hostile takeover using your complete dependence on these patents as leverage. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that happens when corporate executives suddenly realize that their strategic planning has been based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about who actually controls the assets that generate their revenue streams. Not awkward silence, not dramatic pause, just the sound of very expensive legal minds recalculating risk assessments and financial projections in real time. Naomi spoke first, because CFOs are trained to reduce complex emotional situations to quantifiable financial metrics. What are your licensing terms? She asked, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggests someone has already run preliminary calculations and doesn't particularly like the results. I'd rehearsed this moment during countless sessions with Eric at Murphy's Diner, but actually delivering the terms felt surreal, like quoting the price for something that had no real market equivalent. $7 million up front, wired today, confirmed before I leave this building. 25% of net profits from any product or service that utilizes the patents, calculated quarterly and audited annually by independent accounting firms. 5-year renewable term with automatic renegotiation clauses tied to market performance and competitive benchmarking. The numbers hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. $7 million up front was serious money. The kind of cash that could fund a new company, buy a very nice house in several different cities, or provide enough financial security to spend the next decade building whatever seemed interesting without worrying about payroll or venture capital term sheets or board meetings where spouses fire their original inventor husbands. But the ongoing royalty structure was the real weapon. 25% of net profits from patent-dependent products meant that every successful implementation, every new client contract, every expansion into adjacent markets would generate revenue streams that flowed directly to me for the next 5 years, with options to renew under terms that I would have significant leverage to negotiate. And if payments lapse? Victor asked, though I suspect he already knew the answer based on the way he was reviewing what looked like penalty clauses and termination conditions. Automatic reversion, I replied. All licensing rights terminate immediately, and the patents transfer back to my exclusive control with full rights of use, licensing, and sale to any party I choose. Griffin Marks leaned forward on the video screen, his image pixelating slightly as the conference system struggled to keep up with whatever facial expression he was making. What about the alternative? The transfer to outside bidders. Marcus Chun has a Gulfstream fueled and ready, I said, enjoying the way Aurelia's composure cracked just slightly at the mention of our biggest competitor's name. The German consortium is offering exclusive European licensing with guaranteed minimum royalties. The private equity fund specializes in acquiring undervalued intellectual property portfolios and optimizing their deployment through strategic corporate restructuring. I let that sink in for a moment. Strategic corporate restructuring. In private equity terminology, that meant they would purchase my patents, use them as leverage to execute a hostile takeover, fire the existing management team, strip out any non-essential assets, and then either sell the company to the highest bidder or take it public after maximizing operational efficiency and minimizing labor costs. They would essentially be acquiring the foundational technology that makes this company viable, I continued, and then using that control to eliminate their competition while expanding their own market share. It's a textbook example of how intellectual property disputes can become acquisition opportunities if the original patent holder decides that litigation is less profitable than liquidation. Naomi was typing rapidly on her laptop, presumably running calculations that involved quarterly burn rates, current cash positions, and the kind of financial modeling that determines whether companies survive hostile takeover attempts or just become cautionary tales in business school case studies. The licensing terms you're proposing are extraordinary, Victor said, which was lawyer speak for financially devastating but probably legally enforceable. I nodded. So was firing your original inventor in breach of his employment contract and then shredding that contract on camera while delivering prepared remarks about legacy contributions. Extraordinary situations tend to produce extraordinary remedies. The reference to their theatrical paper-shredding performance hit exactly as intended. I could see Aurelia remembering that moment, the deliberate destruction of our shared history, the calculated humiliation, the seamless transition from termination to quarterly pipeline reviews. She'd thought she was demonstrating power, but she'd actually been creating the legal foundation for everything that was happening in this room right now. We need time to review the terms with our board and investors, Griffin said through the video screen, though his tone suggested that the review process would be more about damage control than actual negotiation. No, I replied, checking my watch with the kind of casual precision that courtroom attorneys use when they're establishing deadlines that will determine whether cases settle or proceed to trial. The licensing agreement expires at market close today. After that, my only remaining option is to pursue the transfer alternatives, and frankly, several of the bidders have made it clear that they prefer acquisition strategies over licensing arrangements. Translation. They had approximately 6 hours to wire $7 million and commit to paying me a quarter of their profits for the next 5 years, or I would sell their company's foundational technology to competitors who would use it to destroy them systematically and efficiently. The beauty of the deadline wasn't just its dramatic effect. It was the underlying economic reality that every hour of delay cost them money in operational disruptions, client relationship complications, and investor confidence erosion. German manufacturing contracts were still frozen pending intellectual property verification. Robotic systems were still experiencing authorization failures that generated penalty payments and compliance violations. Share prices were presumably reflecting the kind of uncertainty that makes institutional investors start asking uncomfortable questions about management competence and strategic planning. "We'll need to caucus," Aurelia said, though she was looking at me like she was trying to figure out when exactly I'd stopped being the person she'd married and started being someone who could engineer this kind of corporate warfare with such methodical precision. I closed my leather folio and stood up, straightening my shirt with the same calm dignity I'd displayed during my termination 3 weeks earlier. "You know where to find me," I said. "The diner on Federal Plaza. Same booth, same coffee, Same legal counsel who drafted the employment agreement that you thought you destroyed but apparently didn't read carefully enough. As I walked toward the door, I could hear the beginning of what promised to be a very expensive conversation about wire transfer procedures, board approval processes, and the kind of emergency financial decisions that separate successful companies from footnotes in business school textbooks about intellectual property management and founder relations. They made me wait exactly 47 minutes, which in corporate negotiation terms might as well have been an eternity. I spent that time at Murphy's Diner, occupying the same vinyl booth where Eric and I had engineered this entire legal strategy, drinking coffee that still tasted like it had been brewed during the Bush administration and watching federal courthouse employees grab lunch between depositions and plea bargaining sessions. Eric sat across from me, reviewing his legal pad notes with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 15 years in litigation and understood that corporate capitulation follows predictable patterns. He wasn't nervous. Eric Hale didn't do nervous, which is probably why Fortune 500 general counsels used to pay him $800 an hour to make their problems disappear through superior legal preparation and strategic patience. "They're running calculations," he said, stirring his black coffee with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from knowing your position is legally bulletproof. "Board conference calls, emergency investor updates, wire transfer authorization procedures. 47 minutes is actually faster than I expected for a seven-figure settlement with ongoing royalty obligations." My phone buzzed with a text from Rosa Delgado, a paralegal at Witt, and Deering, who'd apparently been assigned the thankless task of serving as liaison between their crisis management team and the original patent holder, who was currently holding their entire business model hostage. The message was professionally polite and completely devoid of the kind of emotional complexity that should accompany corporate surrender. "Please return to conference room for document execution and wire transfer confirmation." No apology, no acknowledgement of the months of strategic maneuvering that had led to this moment, no recognition that firing your original inventor in breach of his employment contract might have been a suboptimal strategic decision. Just compliance. The kind of procedural efficiency that transforms human relationships into contractual obligations and reduces 15 years of shared innovation into wire transfer protocols and digital signature requirements. I walked back into that walnut-paneled boardroom carrying the same leather folio I'd brought to their corporate execution 3 weeks earlier, but this time the power dynamics had been completely inverted. Instead of theatrical ambush, I found systematic capitulation. Aurelia was still wearing her charcoal Tom Ford suit, but she looked like someone who'd spent the past hour explaining to very important people why the company's most valuable assets were about to become significantly more expensive to utilize. The licensing agreement was spread across that expensive walnut table like a legal autopsy, with every page initialed in what looked like 3 different handwritings. Presumably Aurelia, Victor, and whoever from their board had been granted emergency signature authority for transactions that could fundamentally alter the company's financial trajectory. Rosa Delgado handed me the executed contract with the kind of professional courtesy that courtroom clerks use when they're processing plea agreements and settlement documents. Every page had been initialed, every clause had been accepted, every provision that Eric and I had crafted during our Thursday morning strategy sessions had been formally agreed to by the same people who'd thought they could eliminate me through theatrical paper shredding and corporate restructuring. But the real proof of their surrender was the wire transfer confirmation, printed on official bank letterhead that probably cost more per page than most people make in a day. $7 million, confirmed and processed, deposited into the account that Eric had established specifically for intellectual property licensing revenue and legal settlement proceeds. $7 million. Same-day wire transfer. No negotiation, no payment plan, no request for extended terms or alternative compensation structures. Just immediate, full compliance with every financial demand I'd made. Because the alternative, watching me sell their foundational technology to competitors who would use it for hostile takeover purposes, was apparently too expensive to consider. I reviewed the wire confirmation with the same methodical attention to detail that I'd used when building our first prototype in that broom closet above Payday Paradise. Account numbers matched, routing numbers were correct, the amount was exactly what we demanded, and the timestamp showed that they'd processed the transfer within minutes of my deadline. Corporate efficiency at its finest, when survival depends on moving faster than your legal vulnerabilities. Thank you for your continued partnership, Aurelia said, delivering the line with the kind of practiced corporate diplomacy that transforms surrender into strategic collaboration. Her voice was steady, professional, completely devoid of any acknowledgement that we just concluded a financial negotiation that would define the next 5 years of both our lives. I nodded, signed the final signature page, and walked out into fall air that felt clean enough to taste. The kind of crisp October afternoon that makes Manhattan feel almost livable despite the traffic congestion and the ambient soundtrack of construction projects and emergency sirens. I ordered a Tesla Model S through their app, because when you've just extracted $7 million from people who fired you for being inconvenient, you might as well travel in the kind of electric luxury that makes environmental responsibility feel like a lifestyle choice instead of a moral obligation. The car arrived within 8 minutes, silent and efficient, driven by someone who probably knew more about optimizing rideshare algorithms than most MIT engineering graduates know about actual engineering. The Tesla wound through Manhattan traffic with the kind of smooth acceleration that comes from electric motors and premium suspension systems, past corporate headquarters where other founders were probably experiencing their own versions of boardroom betrayal and intellectual property warfare. Every red light, every pedestrian crossing, every moment of urban congestion gave me time to process what had just happened. Not the financial victory, which was satisfying enough, but the fundamental transformation of my relationship with the company I'd spent 15 years building. I was no longer an employee, no longer a founder, no longer someone whose input was essential for strategic planning and product development. I was a landlord now, collecting rent on intellectual property that other people would use to generate revenue streams and quarterly growth metrics. They could keep their glass tower offices and their professional barista services and their emergency board meetings about quarterly pipeline optimization. I owned the patents that made all their corporate theater possible. The Upper West Side penthouse was mine now, officially and exclusively, thanks to divorce proceedings that had been finalized with the same procedural efficiency that characterized our corporate separation. 15 rooms spread across 2 floors, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of Central Park and the kind of kitchen appliances that food magazines feature in articles about luxury residential architecture. But the best part wasn't the marble countertops or the imported Italian fixtures or the walk-in closet that was larger than our original broom closet office. The best part was standing by those floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over Manhattan's skyline, while holding a glass of Macallan 25 that I'd bought with my own money instead of accepting as some guilt-induced peace offering from someone who thought expensive whiskey could compensate for corporate betrayal. I poured exactly 1 finger of the scotch, savoring the kind of single malt complexity that comes from 25 years of careful aging and probably costs more per ounce than most people make in an hour. The city glittered below like a cap table. Thousands of individual investments and acquisitions and corporate structures, each one representing someone's attempt to transform innovation into equity and dreams into quarterly earnings reports. My laptop chimed with an email notification that managed to be both perfectly timed and completely unexpected. David Park, a venture capital partner I'd met during our Series B fundraising process, someone whose reputation was built on identifying technical founders who could actually execute their vision instead of just presenting compelling pitch decks to limited partners and institutional investors. His message was characteristically brief and intriguing. Heard through the grapevine about your recent IP negotiations. Would love to discuss anchoring a seed round for that SaaS platform you sketched out during our manufacturing compliance conversation. The legal tech space is heating up, and AI contract analysis could be a massive market opportunity if executed correctly. A SaaS platform. Something I've been sketching during random moments over the past few months. Machine learning algorithms trained to read employment agreements, surface potential litigation risks, and lock down compliance requirements before some founder needs to retain expensive corporate attorneys to explain why their intellectual property strategy has developed unexpected vulnerabilities. I'd been thinking about it as a theoretical project, the kind of technical challenge that would be intellectually satisfying to solve even if it never generated significant revenue. But David was right. The legal tech market was expanding rapidly, driven by startups that were discovering the hard way that brilliant technology becomes worthless if your contracts can't protect it and your compliance procedures can't defend it. Let's talk Monday, I replied, because even when you've just extracted $7 million from your former company, you don't make strategic decisions about new ventures while drinking 25-year-old scotch and processing the emotional complexity of corporate warfare and spousal betrayal. But the possibilities were intriguing. A lean legal tech startup, built from the ground up with the kind of methodical attention to intellectual property protection that I'd learned through 15 years of patent development and employment contract negotiation. Machine learning models that could analyze legal language with the precision of experienced attorneys, but the speed and scalability of algorithmic processing. Across town, in that glass tower with the professional barista and the emergency board meetings, they were probably drafting language for their next shareholder letter. Something about continuity secured through strategic licensing partnerships and intellectual property risk mitigation. Corporate communications specialists would transform tonight's surrender into tomorrow's strategic narrative, making $7 million in unexpected licensing payments sound like a planned component of their long-term growth strategy. But I knew what it really meant. They would wire me a percentage of their profits for the next 5 years because they couldn't survive without the technology I'd invented in a broom closet above a payday loan shop, back when innovation was driven by curiosity instead of venture capital returns and quarterly board presentations. They could keep their corporate titles and their Tom Ford suits and their walnut conference tables. I owned the engine, and they'd be paying rent for as long as they wanted it to run. The patents, all 34 of them, still list me as original inventor in the United States Patent and Trademark Office database, and no amount of corporate restructuring or executive reshuffling can change that fundamental fact. Every quarterly payment arrives like clockwork, wired from their corporate account to mine with the procedural efficiency that comes from having no other choice. They can rebrand their strategy, optimize their messaging, and pivot their investor relations narrative all they want. But at the end of every 90-day period, they wire me 25% of their net profits because they still need my technology to exist as a viable business entity. Aurelia keeps the CEO title for now, though for now is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The board meetings I'm no longer invited to attend are presumably featuring the kind of uncomfortable discussions about leadership effectiveness and strategic vision that happen when your company's most valuable assets are owned by someone who has absolutely no incentive to make your life easier. Every roadmap presentation, every investor pitch deck, every shareholder communication includes a footnote that she can't delete, edit, or minimize. Ongoing intellectual property licensing obligations that represent a permanent reminder of what happens when you fire your original inventor without reading the fine print in his employment contract. I don't need revenge posts on LinkedIn or Twitter manifestos about founder mistreatment or tell-all interviews with tech journalism platforms that specialize in corporate drama and startup failure narratives. I have something better than public vindication. I have a revenue stream that automatically renews itself every quarter, generating more passive income than most venture capital partners make from their carried interest and management fees. LedgerForge Labs launched 6 months after my corporate emancipation, operating out of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn that costs approximately 1/10 of what they're paying for their glass tower lease in Manhattan's financial district. The space is deliberately Spartan. Exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, furniture that prioritizes function over Instagram aesthetics. No professional barista, no Herman Miller chairs, no conference rooms with names inspired by Silicon Valley mythology. Just clean workbenches, multiple monitor setups, and the kind of collaborative environment that actually facilitates building things instead of just talking about building things. Our core product is elegant in its simplicity. Machine learning models trained on millions of employment agreements, merger documentation, intellectual property transfers, and litigation settlements. The algorithms can parse legal language faster than teams of junior associates and identify potential liability exposures with accuracy rates that make big law partners nervous about their billable hour sustainability models. We call it Contract IQ, and it's designed to prevent the kind of intellectual property disasters that happen when corporate lawyers assume they understand technical founder agreements without actually reading them. Ria Kim joined as head of machine learning after her temporary assignment to that AI innovation pod became permanent in the most corporate way possible. Her position was eliminated during a strategic reorganization that coincidentally occurred 2 weeks after I demonstrated that their most valuable patents belonged to someone who was no longer particularly interested in their corporate success. She brought deep expertise in natural language processing and the kind of algorithmic sophistication that can teach computers to think like attorneys without developing the ethical complications that sometimes afflict actual attorneys. Dario Velis handles our back-end architecture with the methodical precision that made him invaluable during our early patent development phases. He built systems that scale efficiently without requiring the kind of infrastructure investment that makes CFOs wake up in cold sweats, and he understands that sustainable growth comes from solving real problems instead of optimizing user engagement metrics and viral coefficient calculations. Anke Vogel moonlights as our European compliance consultant, which is the corporate equivalent of hiring a Swiss watchmaker to ensure your intellectual property protections can survive German engineering standards and EU regulatory scrutiny. Her legal expertise has been instrumental in developing contract analysis modules that work across multiple jurisdictions and legal frameworks, because apparently building technology that only functions in American courts is like building cars that only work on American roads. Technically possible, but strategically limiting. Eric Hale took a small equity slice in lieu of his usual hourly fees, partly because he believes in the platform's market potential and partly because he enjoys the poetic justice of building legal technology that helps founders protect themselves from the kind of corporate betrayal that we just spent months navigating successfully. He chairs our advisory board and provides strategic guidance on intellectual property development, ensuring that everything we build is protected by the same methodical legal preparation that made Paragraph 7 such an elegant weapon. We've also diversified into private equity through a friends and family syndicate that takes small stakes in manufacturing companies that could benefit from automation technology licensing. 3 scrappy factories in Ohio, Michigan, and North Carolina, each one implementing our patents through carefully structured agreements that generate additional revenue streams while supporting American manufacturing jobs. It's the kind of investment strategy that feels morally satisfying while producing attractive returns, which is apparently rare enough in the private equity world to be noteworthy. The beautiful thing about owning foundational technology is that market demand only increases over time. Every new client that my former company acquires, every expansion into adjacent markets, every strategic partnership they develop generates additional licensing revenue that flows directly to me. Their success literally pays my bills, which creates the kind of perverse incentive structure that probably keeps their strategic planning teams awake at night. Sometimes I think about that paper shredder and the sound it made while destroying what Aurelia thought was the foundation of our partnership. The mechanical grinding of documents that she believed represented 15 years of shared innovation and mutual trust. But that sound wasn't the end of anything. It was the activation of a legal mechanism that I'd installed in a greasy diner years earlier, hidden in plain sight among employment boilerplate that corporate attorneys skim over on their way to more important clauses. She called it loyalty. I call it Paragraph 7. They can keep their glass tower headquarters and their emergency board meetings and their quarterly investor presentations about strategic pivots and market positioning. They can maintain their corporate titles and their Tom Ford wardrobes and their professional photography for LinkedIn profiles that project competence and executive authority. But I own the engine that makes it all possible, and they'll be paying rent for as long as they want it to keep running. Every patent, every innovation, every technological breakthrough that generates revenue gets filtered through licensing agreements that were crafted with Swiss precision and enforced with German efficiency. It's the most expensive lesson in contract law they'll ever receive, and the tuition payments are due every quarter for the next 5 years.